Earth, Pier 3 Fort Mason, on San Francisco's northern waterfront, is a relic to one of industrialized man's most impressive efforts. Hardly unique to begin with, it was one of over 2,700 almost identical ships built to meet the demands of World War II. But today, there is only one. Officially, it is designated United States Maritime Commission Emergency Cargo Vessel, Type EC2-S-C1, hull number 230. It is the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the last remaining unaltered Liberty ship in operating condition. In 1940, Europe was at war. England stood alone against the Nazi spread, and her supply lines were being cut. The U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain's yards could build them. If the free world was going to win the Battle of the Atlantic, the supplies had to get through. More merchant ships were needed, many, many more. They had to be built, and the obvious place was the United States. America was neutral, safe, and had the industrial muscle. In September 1940, a British merchant shipbuilding mission, through the United States Maritime Commission, arranged for the construction of 60 ships of a proven design, type-named Ocean-class cargo vessel. With America's modest shipbuilding capacity already at its limits, this first effort required the construction of 2 new shipyards and a commitment to the novel concept of the all-welded vessel. To meet this order, a syndicate was formed by Todd Shipyards and the engineering and construction companies of American industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. The original 60-ship Ocean contract was fulfilled and became the proof of concept for what was to follow: the construction of a merchant armada that would bring the guns of freedom's industrial power to bear on Hitler's war machine. In February 1941, President Roosevelt announced an emergency program to build 200 cargo vessels known as the Emergency Fleet, which would be based on the Ocean design modified for mass production. Nicknamed the Liberty Fleet, they were homely vessels, considered expendable war products to be built cheaply, quickly, and simply. In all, by differing accounts, between 2,710 and 2,751 were built. They were 11-knot vessels of over 7,100 gross tons with an overall length of 441 feet. 18 United States shipyards were involved in the Liberty ship program. The first Liberty, the Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941. It was said that at the peak of production, from all the slipways and all the yards, America launched a Liberty ship a day. The all-time record was set by the Robert E. Perry, which was launched November 12, 1942, just 4 days, 15½ hours after keel laying. During the course of the war, over 200 Liberty ships were lost, about 50 of them on their maiden voyages. At the end of the war, most of the fleet was allocated for purchase by Allied nations as well as for domestic use. The rest were laid up in 8 different mothball fleets around the country to await a new crisis, deterioration, and the shipwrecker's torch.
The Jeremiah O'Brien was built in 57 days in South Portland, Maine by the New England Shipbuilding Corporation. And she started off, she was launched 19th of June, 1943. And by the end of June 43, she was outfitted and delivered to her operators, Graceline, who operated her during her entire service career. And she started out from South Portland, Maine to Boston on her first voyage, first of 7. The first 4 voyages were back and forth across the North Atlantic. She also spent time in shuttle service, very interesting aspect of her career, between the United Kingdom and the Normandy beachheads in support of the D-Day invasion in 1944. She then came back to the United States and made a trip to South America. From there, she sailed back to a Gulf port in the U.S., and then out to the Far East. Her first trip to the South Pacific was Australia, and the Philippines. She then returned to the U.S. West Coast and proceeded on her 7th and final voyage, which took her all the way to Calcutta, Shanghai, Manila, and eventually back to San Francisco in very early 1946. A few weeks after arriving back in port in the United States, the war was over by then, she was laid up in the Suisun Bay National Defense Reserve Fleet, right near Benicia, California. And she rode at anchor there, very carefully preserved, I might add, slathered with cosmoline and consul oil by the Maritime Administration for about 33 years before her reactivation began in 1979.
Suisun Bay was one of 8 original layup sites where hundreds of surplus vessels were mothballed and held in reserve for future emergencies. Some were actually reactivated for duty in Korea, the Suez Canal, and Vietnam, but most just grew obsolete, even as expendable emergency vessels. They decayed and were sold for scrap. Remarkably, the Jeremiah O'Brien was never reactivated in spite of her relatively sound condition. And fortunately, she escaped the scrapper's torch and remained well preserved in her maritime rest home. Chief Engineer Harry Morgan reflects on what condition she was in 1979.
The reserve fleet did a tremendous job of preserving it. They opened up everything and they filled the ship up with cosmoline. They sprayed the boilers inside and out, all the machinery. It was just a slimy cosmoline mess when we went aboard it. And I became a firm believer in cosmoline now, that if you want to preserve something you never plan on using again, coat it with cosmoline. We're still trying to get rid of it. She is in excellent shape, in better shape than some of the new ships that I have taken out.
The resurrection began in 1978 with the formation of the National Liberty Ship Memorial, founded specifically for the purpose of restoring, preserving, and presenting to the public the world's last remaining operational Liberty ship in original configuration.
June of 1979, the OCMI of the United States Coast Guard, Ernie Murdoch, asked me to come up and look at a Liberty ship in Suisun Bay that they wanted to bring out and restore, since it was the last ship that they assumed was in operational condition. I went up and looked at it, and I said, well, it looks to be in pretty good shape. It only run for 3 years. I think when we tow it down to the shipyards and get it cleaned up, we can make something out of it. And he says, we are going to steam it down. I says, you're out of your gourd. He says, no, you can do it. So we got the volunteers together, and we worked on it from June until October of 1979, working out in the fleet, in the bay. We had no water, no sanitary facilities. A boat would take us out in the morning and pick us up in the late afternoon and bring us back in. Very minimal lighting, but we had to get the ship back together, close up the engines, close up the boilers. And about the first week of October, if I remember correctly, we fired up a boiler and we put the steam to the main engine, and it started to run, and I think I was probably the most surprised guy up there.
I'd say when I joined it, she was probably 30% restored, and now she's about 95% restored. We are deliberately leaving one room down on the main deck as in its original condition when we got the ship. We plan on putting a sign up, or a placard saying this is the way it was, to give people an idea of what we had to do. I think one way to really explain it, when the ships lay up, they leave all the portholes and everything open to allow air to pass through the ship. This, of course, leaves birds to nest inside, and Lord knows what goes on. A perfect example is this compass here had been removed, and there was a nest built in this binnacle in which there was 2 eggs when they took the ship out of the shipyard, out of the layup fleet.
Anyway, on October the 10th, we steamed the engines up and everything, and they brought a bunch of passengers up from Crowley's harbor tour, and we steamed down from Suisun Bay, and the ship, for the first time in 33 years and 8 months, was back to life again. And she must have been happy about it because she didn't give us any trouble all the way down.
Today, the Jeremiah O'Brien is moored at Pier 3 East, Fort Mason Center, the guest of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and is open for public inspection. The Liberty Ship Memorial receives no tax money and relies on donations, grants, and the income from her annual bay cruises.
People often ask, who is it who is restoring the Jeremiah O'Brien? Who's involved with this? Are they all old salts or old sailors? Are they all old Liberty ship sailors? Well, the answer is that out of the 200 and some volunteers who are currently active, about 10% sailed Liberty ships, actually sailed on Liberty ships. About 12% are women, and of course, while women were very much involved in the construction of Liberties, and also as workers for the component suppliers and ship chandlers and so forth, no women sailed on Liberty ships. A lot of the people who are active today really had no connection with the sea. Some of them weren't even born when Liberty ships were in operation in the 40s. They do all kinds of jobs. There's constantly work to be done. The restoration of the ship is virtually complete. However, the tremendous task of maintenance and preservation is now what occupies most of our shipboard volunteers' time.
We have about what we call hardcore volunteers, about 30, that show up here very faithfully 2 or 3 times a week, and they work 6 and 8 hours a day. Some come from as far as Santa Cruz, some come from Concord, some come from Sacramento, just to be on this ship and help us restore it and preserve it. I think that in itself indicates the appeal of this ship to people who were probably during the war had either sailed in them or built them or worked on them in one way or another. We have Wendy the welder. She was here today. She's one of the people that have worked over in Richmond shipyards to build these ships. We have several women that come here for that.
Everything had to be taken completely apart, bulkheads removed, all these bulkheads removed, refurnished and put back up. All the woodwork, the wheels and everything, they were taken down on deck, sanded, thoroughly bleached, and refinished. It is a wonderful tribute to the volunteers, the many hours they put in and the hard work they did to accomplish this.
The heart of the ship is the engine room, a most uncomfortable place. Yet hardly a visitor leaves the Jeremiah without first braving the heat and noise. It's like walking around inside the crankcase of your car's engine. The Jeremiah's boilers were manufactured in Dansville, New York by the Foster Wheeler Corporation, one of 9 manufacturers used. Designed to use bunker C black oil, she now burns salvage crankcase trainings, other assorted waste oils, and even occasionally real fuel oil when acquired by donation. Her triple expansion engine was built by General Machinery Corporation in Hamilton, Ohio, one of 14 American engine manufacturers that participated in the Liberty Shipbuilding Program. Its 3 cylinders develop 2,500 horsepower to turn a single screw at 76 RPM for an average cruising speed of 11 knots.
The basic design of the ship is we have 2 boilers which supply steam at 220 pounds of steam pressure to a triple expansion steam engine, which takes the steam and it expands it 3 times in 3 different cylinders of various diameters to completely use the steam from 220 pounds to 25 inches of vacuum. The steam then is exhausted into the main condenser, which is cooled by seawater, which condenses the steam back to condensate or fresh water, and the feed pumps pick it up and put it back in the boiler, and they start the cycle all over again. The reason the engine is in this ship, it was something that can be built from low quality materials. It could be built fast, and it can be built economically.
If the engine room is the heart of the ship, the bridge is the brain. As with most of the Jeremiah, the wheelhouse is restored with original equipment, using a minimum of replica parts. The wheel and the compass, for example, were salvaged from other Liberty ships. When conditions permitted, Liberty ships were navigated from the flying bridge, where visibility was virtually unlimited. Passengers on annual cruises and some lucky weekend visitors have the opportunity of seeing the steam-powered loading equipment put to use. Nothing is a facade on the Jeremiah O'Brien. She is fully operational in every detail. Electronics buffs will be fascinated by the radio room. Today's radio operators won't recognize a thing. And true to her authenticity, the Jeremiah serves meals to her volunteers in the officers' and crew mess rooms. Meals prepared in her fully restored, 100% original coal-fired galley stove. Today, the Jeremiah O'Brien proudly welcomes guests from all over the world.
Coming aboard as a visitor, it's really quite fun because you have 441 feet of cargo vessel to explore. You can go down to the floor plates in the engine room, you can go up to the flying bridge, you can go into the bow and the stern and train the defensive weapons that are mounted there as original. You can wander all around the decks. Ask questions of volunteers working on board, have a docent-guided tour if you wish, or take a stereo tape tour, Antenna Theater's Walkman tour of the ship, which is available on weekends. You can also sail on board the Jeremiah O'Brien at least twice a year. She goes out on various excursions, but 2 regularly scheduled cruises in the 3rd weekend in May. And you can generally recreate life at sea as it was in the 1940s. An additional adjunct is music of the 40s, which we often have playing over the ship's loudspeaker system. But you can really see the way the 42 merchant seamen and 8 to 28 U.S. Navy Armed Guard sailors who defended Liberty ships lived in those days.
Today I went up on the bridge and steered the ship there for about a half an hour. The first time I steered the ship, and oh God, it must have been 30 years since I really brought back a lot of memories. A lot of memories. This is the last ship out of, let's see, it was 2,741 built. This is the last one, and we volunteers, you know, mostly a lot of ex-seamen took the ship down and redid it. It looks better than it did when we sailed on them.
I served on the Jeremiah for 3 trips during 1943 and 44, including the invasion of Normandy. Since then, I've lived in the East Bay for several years and done a lot of fishing out by the Mothball Fleet near the Benicia Bridge. And little did I realize that the Jeremiah was there until just a few years ago when they started pulling it out of mothballs. There's been a few things that have changed, I think, on the ship. You know, like the mirrormaids up in on the forward gun mount weren't there, and I think there is a couple gun mounts up forward that weren't there during the war, or at least while I was on it. Outside of that, it looks about the same.
She serves as a monument to American ingenuity and to the national spirit which prevailed in one of history's most regrettable global events, and as a memorial to the United States Merchant Marine, those civilian seamen who sailed the Liberty ships and other merchant vessels, especially the more than 6,000 seamen who never returned. She was restored in tribute to the millions of men and women who built, sailed, and defended the great Bridge of Ships, America's last unaltered Liberty ship in operating condition, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien.
They were merchant vessels crewed by civilians, merchant crews. Civilians not drafted. They were remunerated for their services, just as they would be in peacetime in a commercial operation. But they were basically volunteers. They went voluntarily into war zones, and over 6,000 of them never came back from those war zones, incidentally. It's another fact that sometimes isn't realized. We think of the losses of the Army and Navy. We don't think of the losses of our own civilians on our merchant fleet. And I think that's a very important aspect of the Jeremiah O'Brien's symbolism for visitors and for the country.